What if Daemon Targaryen trained Jon Snow? The snow had been falling upon Winterfell for 3 days without pause when the stranger came to its gates, a lone figure emerging from the white haze of the Wolfswood like something half-remembered from an old song. The guards upon the walls saw him first as a smudge against the endless pale expanse, a man walking where no man should have been walking, without horse or cart or companion, wrapped in a cloak the color of old ash and leaning upon a staff that might once have been a spear. He moved slowly, for the cold had found its way into his bones, and the drifts came near to his knees. Yet there was in his bearing something that did not belong to a beggar or a wandering hedge knight, some remnant of an older pride that even hunger and exile had not managed to grind entirely away. When they brought him through the gate and into the courtyard, shaking the snow from his shoulders and stamping the frost from his boots, the household looked upon him with the wariness that northerners reserved for all strangers who came in winter, and they saw a gaunt man whose face had been carved thin by years of hard living, whose hair beneath the frost was the pale silver of moonlight upon still water. His eyes were a deep and startling violet, and though they were sunk with weariness, they moved across the yard with a swiftness that missed nothing, marking the placement of the guards, the height of the walls, the doors that led inward, and the doors that led out. Ned Stark received him in his solar, alone but for the fire that snapped and hissed within the hearth, and the two men regarded one another across the warm and shifting light for a long moment before either spoke. The Lord of Winterfell was not a man given to hasty judgment, and he had learned in his years of war and its aftermath to read the truth of a man in the set of his shoulders and the steadiness of his gaze, and what he read in the stranger unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. "You will forgive me," Ned said at last, "if I ask your name before I offer you my bread and salt, for you have the look of a man who has carried a heavy secret a long way." The stranger smiled, and it was a thin and bitter thing, the smile of one who had smiled at worse than death. "You would not believe the name if I gave it plainly," he said, and his voice was rough with disuse, yet carried still the cadence of high courts, long since fallen to dust. "So I shall give it, and let you make of it what you will. I was born Daemon, of House Targaryen, brother to a king, husband to a queen, rider of the dragon men called Caraxes, and I did not die above the god's eye as the singers would have it. I fell, and I lived, and I have wandered these long decades as a ghost that the world believed it had already buried." Ned Stark did not move, but something in the stillness of him became more absolute. As a man grows still before a wolf, he has not yet decided whether to fight or flee. He knew the old histories, as all lords knew them, the terrible reckoning of the dance, when the dragons had turned upon one another, and the realm had drowned in Targaryen blood, and he understood the weight of what he was hearing, and the danger it carried into his hall like a blade wrapped in cloth. Yet the man before him had spoken plainly, without pleading and without threat, and there was a soldier's honesty in the confession that Ned found himself unable to dismiss. "If what you say is true," Ned said slowly, "then there are men across the narrow sea and within these lands both who would pay well for your head, and to shelter you is to invite their eyes upon my house. I want nothing but a roof and a wall between myself and the wind," Daemon answered. "I am old, Lord Stark, and I am tired, and the crown that hunted me has long since passed to men who scarcely remember my name. I ask only shelter through the winter. In return, I will teach your household the sword, for that at least I have not forgotten, and I have never forgotten it." Guest right was an ancient thing in the north, older than the faith and older than the kings who had ruled before the dragons came. and Ned Stark was bound by it as surely as he was bound by his own honor. He allowed the man to stay, though not without extracting his price, for he made Daemon swear upon whatever gods he still held that he would speak no word of dragons or crowns. And later, when Ned confronted him in the tower, that broken oath would sit unspoken between them like a drawn knife. Catelyn objected fiercely when she learned of it, catching her husband in the shadowed corridor beyond the solar with her voice low and her eyes bright with alarm, for she had seen the stranger's restless gaze, and she trusted it not at all. Yet Ned held firm, and the matter was settled, and Daemon Targaryen took his place as swordmaster to the household of Winterfell. It was upon the third morning of his teaching, as the frost lay thick upon the training yard, and Robb Stark clashed wooden swords against the master-at-arms, that Daemon noticed a boy watching from the shadow of the covered walk, dark-haired and silent, his gray eyes following every stroke with a hunger that no lesson had been offered to feed. The boy did not know he had been seen, or if he knew, he did not flinch from it, and this alone told Daemon a great deal about the child who lingered in the frost-blue dark before the household had stirred. He had come to know that hunger in others across the long years of his life, had seen it in the eyes of men who possessed nothing and wanted everything, and he understood that such hunger, properly shaped, could be forged into something far sharper than any blade a smith might hammer at his forge. So it was that on the following morning, well before the eastern sky had begun to pale, Daemon rose from his narrow cot and made his way to the smaller yard behind the armory, where the snow lay untrodden, and the walls kept the wind from finding a man's bones. And there he waited, two practiced swords tucked beneath his arm, until the boy came. Jon Snow came as Daemon had known he would, drawn by the promise of a whispered word left the evening before, and he stood at the threshold of that hidden yard with the wariness of a creature accustomed to being sent away from things that other boys were freely given. Daemon tossed him one of the wooden swords without ceremony, and the boy caught it clean, which pleased the old dragon more than he allowed his face to show. And then Daemon set to work dismantling everything the boy thought he knew. "Sir Roderick teaches you to plant your feet like a fence post and swing as though you meant to fell a tree," Daemon said, circling the boy in the pale light, his own boots leaving no more sound than a cat's upon the packed snow. "That is how men are taught to die slowly. A tree does not move. You will move, and you will move like water finding the cracks in a wall. And when your enemy has committed his strength to the place where you were, you will already be at the place where he is weak." He struck then, not cruelly but swiftly, and rapped the boy across the knuckles, and when Jon dropped his guard in surprise, Daemon tapped him lightly beneath the chin. "There. You are dead. Learn to stop being dead." The lessons that followed were unlike anything the boy had known, for Daemon wove the fluid dancing footwork of Braavos into the brutal, economical killing strokes of a man who had ended lives on real battlefields where no septon watched to score the blows, and he demanded of Jon a doubled measure of everything he asked. "You are a bastard," he said one morning, as the boy lay panting in the snow. And though the word had cut Jon 1,000 times before, it did not cut in the way the boy expected. That means the world has already decided to give you half of what it gives another man. Half the trust, half the welcome, half the name. So you will be twice as deadly as any true-born fool who never had to earn his place, and then the arithmetic will favor you at last. It was inevitable that in the intimacy of those cold dawns, the boy began to speak of the things he carried, and he spoke of his mother whom he had never known, whose name his father would not utter, and of the ache of belonging nowhere, of being neither Stark nor common, neither son nor stranger, a shadow in his own home. Daemon listened, and as he listened, he studied the boy's coloring in the growing light, the fineness of his bearing that no scullion's blood would explain, and he held his own counsel behind his violet eyes and said none of what stirred in his mind. "A name is a chain," he told the boy instead, quietly, "and fools wear it willingly and call it honor. Your worth will not be given to you by a name, boy. It will be forged, the way steel is forged, in heat and in hammering, and no man who was born to comfort will ever understand what men like you and I can become." The secret could not keep, for secrets never do within stone walls where children watch one another with the keenness of hawks. And it was Robb who discovered it, following his half-brother into the gray hour before the horn and finding him crossed swords with the swordmaster in a yard where no lessons were meant to happen. Robb was not angry, or not only angry, but stung and bewildered that this thing had been withheld from him, the heir, when it had been offered to the bastard, and he demanded in the hot flush of his indignation to be trained as well. Daemon regarded the two boys standing side by side in the snow, the true-born wolf and the shadow, and after a moment he agreed, for it suited his purposes to have both, though what he observed in the days that followed, he kept locked behind his teeth. Robb fought like a lord who had never once imagined losing, with a bright and generous confidence that made him formidable and predictable in equal measure, while Jon fought like a man who had nothing in all the world to protect but the ground beneath his own 2 feet, and there was a cold hunger in the bastard's blade that the heir would never possess because the heir had never needed it. Daemon watched this difference sharpen with each passing dawn, and he knew which of the two was the more dangerous and the more promising, and he felt the old familiar pull of a man recognizing his own reflection in another. And in the great hall, watching his sons grow closer to the stranger he had sheltered, Ned Stark felt something tighten in his chest that he could not yet name. The seasons turned twice over the walls of Winterfell, and in that span of time, the boy who had come to the yard as a hesitant thing of lowered eyes and careful courtesies became something altogether different beneath the exile's tutelage. Daemon Targaryen did not teach the way the master-at-arms taught, with repetition and patience and the steady accretion of small correct habits, but rather the way a smith worked hot iron, striking hard and often, folding the metal upon itself until every softness had been hammered out of it. He drilled Jon before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, and long after the other boys had gone to their suppers, and the bastard learned to move as few men living could move, to read the shift of weight in an opponent's shoulder before the strike came, to make his blade an extension of thought rather than muscle. Yet the sword was the least of what Daemon gave him. In the long blue evenings, when the fires burned low in the tower chamber that had become their private province, the older man would settle into a chair with a cup of Dornish red and speak of the things that had shaped the world, and Jon would sit upon the stone floor with his knees drawn up, listening as though his very life depended on remembering every word. Daemon spoke of the dance of the dragons, of the beautiful and terrible war in which brother had burned sister, and the sky itself had been filled with fire and screaming, and he spoke without romance, without the golden haze that septons and singers laid over such things. "They died," Daemon said once, turning the cup slowly in his scarred fingers, "not because they were wicked, though many were, but because they believed the thing they were owed was theirs by right, and a right that cannot defend itself is only a wish spoken aloud." He watched the flames a moment. Rhaenyra had the better claim. She had the crown promised to her before witnesses, oaths sworn on the memory of dead kings, And it availed her nothing, boy, because oaths are wind, and men obey the sword, and the coin, and the fear of consequence, and they call it honor afterward, so they may sleep. Jon drank these lessons the way parched earth drinks rain, and something in him that had lain coiled and waiting since birth began at last to uncurl and stand upright. He learned that power was a machine of many parts, that a lord's strength lay not in his prowess, but in the men who owed him, and the men who feared him, and the delicate balance between the two. He learned that mercy was a currency to be spent deliberately and never squandered, that a promise made was a debt that could be called in years hence, that the appearance of a thing often mattered more than the thing itself. And through it all, Daemon returned, again and again, to a single hard truth wrapped in the guise of many tales, which was that ambition carried a terrible cost, but powerlessness carried a costlier one, and that the men who suffered most in this world were not the grasping, but the meek who had never learned to grasp at all. Ned Stark saw the change in his son before he understood it, and the understanding, when it came, arrived like cold water. He found Jon in the Godswood one afternoon, sitting beneath the heart tree with a stillness that had nothing of a boy in it. And when Ned spoke to him of duty, and of the old gods, and of the vows that bound the Starks to the north, Jon answered him with a courtesy that was flawless and utterly hollow, agreeing with everything and believing none of it. And Ned walked away with a hollowness of his own opening in his chest. That night he climbed the steps to Daemon's chamber and did not knock. The Targaryen sat by his fire as always, and he did not rise, and the two men regarded each other across a silence that had been 2 years in the building. "You are poisoning him," Ned said at last, his voice low and steady, in the way that men who rarely raised it were steady. "You are taking a good boy and teaching him that nothing in the world is worth believing in but his own advantage." Daemon's smile was thin and without warmth. "Honor," he said, "got my brother's dream burned to ash. Honor got Rhaenyra devoured before her son's eyes. Honor, Lord Stark, has a way of killing everyone a man loves, while he stands over their graves with clean hands and a clear conscience." He set his cup down with deliberate care. "I am giving that boy the armor you never had the stomach to forge for him, because you love the idea of him more than you have ever loved the danger of him. He is a bastard in a world that eats bastards, and you would send him into it wearing nothing but your name and a smile." Ned had no answer that did not feel, even to himself, like a thing spoken from another age. The reckoning came 3 days later in the yard, over a matter as small as a horse. Theon Greyjoy had laid claim to a gray courser that Jon had broken and trained through the autumn, and where once Jon would have surrendered it with a bowed head, he now stood before the assembled men and laid out the ward's debts and dependencies and the precise shape of his standing at Winterfell with such quiet, devastating precision that Theon was left crimson-faced and silent, humiliated before the very men he sought to impress. Ned watched from the covered gallery, and he knew in that moment that Winterfell had grown too small to hold what his son was becoming, and that a decision he had long avoided could be avoided no longer. The king came in the last soft days before the true cold, and he came as a storm comes, announced long before its arrival by the trembling of the ground beneath 100 horses. Robert Baratheon rode north at the head of a column that stretched back beyond the site of Winterfell's gate, banners of gold and black snapping in a wind that smelled of iron and coming frost. And when he dismounted in the yard, he was already a larger man than the songs remembered, heavy with years and wine, and the slow rot of a crown worn without joy. Ned went to one knee upon the cold stones, and around him his household knelt as well. and among the shadows of the covered walkways, there stood a man who did not kneel, who watched with pale eyes from beneath a hood drawn close, and who understood better than any soul present exactly how many ways this visit could end in blood. Daemon had known from the moment the Outriders were sighted that he must become a ghost. He knew these faces, or their fathers' faces, in the way a hunted thing knows the hounds by their voices in the dark. He had bled beside some of them and against others, and there was not a man in the king's train who would not gladly carry his head south for the price such a trophy would fetch. So while the feast roared to life in the great hall, while roasted meats and spiced wine flowed, and Robert bellowed his grief and his affection at Ned across the high table, Daemon kept to the crypts beneath the castle, moving among the stone kings of winter with the ease of a man long accustomed to the company of the dead. Yet even there, the past came reaching for him. On the second night, as he climbed a servant's stair to take air in a forgotten corner of the godswood, he passed a slight, sharp-eyed man in the livery of the crown, a keeper of coin and ledgers whose recognition would, weeks later, send a discreet letter south that Daemon's own agents intercepted and answered with a quiet coin, so that the man was found drowned in the Blackwater before he could sell what he had seen, whose family had once bent the knee to dragons and had spent every year since pretending otherwise. The man's gaze lingered a heartbeat too long, then widened, then dropped in the careful blankness of someone who has decided, for now, to have seen nothing. Daemon did not run. He walked on with the unhurried gait of an old retainer, but that night he found Jon in the armory and spoke to him with a quiet urgency the boy had not heard before. "The realm is a nest of knives," he said, turning a whetstone slowly against a blade that needed no sharpening, "and every hand that offers you bread is measuring your throat. A face remembered in the wrong corridor is worth more than gold to some men. Remember this when you walk among them. Remember that safety is a story we tell children, and that you are no longer a child." Benjen came to Jon on the third day, as Daemon had foreseen he would, speaking with the warm gravity of a man offering a gift he believed noble. The wall, he said, was a place where a bastard might rise as high as any true-born lord, where the name a man was born with mattered less than the steel in his spine. Jon listened, and once the words would have kindled in him like fire in dry tinder, for the black had always seemed the one honorable door open to a boy of his birth. But Daemon had prepared him for this moment across 100 quiet conversations, and so when Jon went to Ned in the Solar that evening, he did not ask for leave to take the black. "I would ask you for a purpose worthy of what you have made me," Jon said, standing very still in the candlelight while the wind pressed at the shutters. "Not a grave at the end of the world, not a life spent watching for enemies who never come, while my skill rusts in the cold. Give me something that matters, Father. Give me a place where what I am can be of use to you and to our house." Ned's silence stretched long, and into it, later, when the boy had gone, came Daemon's voice from the shadow by the hearth, low and reasonable, and impossible to dismiss. To send a trained killer to the wall, he told Ned, was to bury a sword in a snowbank and call it duty. The boy had gifts that the realm would soon have desperate need of, and a father who loved him would not squander them upon a wall of ice. Ned did not answer, but the shape of Jon's fate had already begun to bend away from the Night's Watch, turning towards some other road not yet visible. Then Bran climbed the broken tower, as boys will climb, and saw what he was never meant to see, and fell, and his direwolf pup howled through the long night, as though it too understood the wound that had opened in the house. The castle fractured into grief and whispered dread, and in the long, uneasy nights that followed, Daemon prowled the walls out of an old habit that had kept him alive through wars other men had not survived. So it was that he glimpsed a shadow near the sick room where the broken boy lay sleeping, a figure moving with a purpose that had nothing of mercy in it. And though the man slipped away before Daemon could close the distance, the meaning of that passage settled into his bones like cold. He found Jon before dawn and spoke plainly. A fall was an accident, but a knife in the dark was a message, and someone with power enough to reach into Winterfell itself wanted the Starks silenced before they learned a truth worth killing to keep buried. The morning of Ned's departure came gray and windless, the sky pressing low over Winterfell like a lid upon a cooking pot, and the courtyard filled with the sounds of horses stamping and wagons groaning under the weight of provisions for the long road south. Ned Stark moved among his people with the heavy calm of a man who had already made his hardest decisions in the private hours before dawn, and there was in his face a weariness that had less to do with the journey than with the choices he had reached in the dark. He found Daemon near the stables, where the old prince stood watching the bustle with the detachment of one who had seen 100 such departures and outlived most of the men who had ridden away in them. Ned did not waste words. He told Daemon that Jon would not go to the wall. He had turned the matter over through many sleepless nights, and he had come at last to a decision that surprised even himself, for he asked Daemon to take the boy east, across the narrow sea, to learn the wider world and to grow into a man beyond the reach of the whispers that named him bastard in every hall of the north. Distance, Ned hoped, would cool whatever dangerous thing had kindled between the boy and the exile, and it would give Jon a future unmarked by the stain that would follow him wherever the name Snow was spoken. He said all this plainly, watching Daemon's eyes, and there was a pleading beneath his lordly bearing that he could not quite conceal. Daemon accepted at once, and if his eagerness seemed to Ned merely the readiness of a restless man for a new purpose, the truth ran far deeper and far colder. For Daemon had watched Jon closely across the long autumn, had studied the boy's gray eyes and dark hair and the strange, fierce quietness in him, and he had begun to suspect a thing that made his old heart beat with a hunger he had thought long dead. He believed that Jon was no bastard of Ned Stark at all, but the hidden son of Rhaegar Targaryen, the last true dragon, slipped into the world and disguised in northern gray, and in that suspicion, Daemon saw a legacy that might redeem the ruin of his own scattered years. He said nothing of this. He was a patient man, schooled by a life of waiting and watching, and he knew that some truths must ripen before they are spoken, so he bowed his head and gave Ned his word, and let the lie of simple mentorship stand between them like a curtain drawn across a lamp. So the party rode south together for a time, Ned and his daughters bound for King's Landing, Daemon and Jon meaning to part from them along the way and turn toward the eastern ports, where passage across the narrow sea might be bought. The girls filled the road with their small quarrels and their wonder, Sansa dreaming of a southern court she had never seen, and Arya scowling at the very notion of it. And Jon rode a little apart, feeling already the strange ache of a leaving that had not yet fully arrived. Daemon rode beside him and spoke of the free cities, of Braavos and its Titan, of Pentos and Volantis, and the old blood that ran through the eastern lands, planting in the boy a curiosity to soften the pain of departure. The road unspooled beneath them mile by mile, and for a few days, the world seemed almost gentle. Then word came galloping up from behind them, a rider spent and gray-faced, bearing news that the broken boy had woken to danger. The cat's paw had come again, as such men will when their first passage fails, and this time he had crept into the sick room itself with fire and steel, meaning to end what the fall had not. Yet Jon and Daemon had lingered near, drawn back by some instinct or some errand of the old prince's making, and they were within the walls when the man made his move. What followed was swift and ugly in the way of all true violence, nothing like the songs. The assassin was strong and desperate, and he had a blade of Valyrian make that gleamed wickedly in the dim room. But Daemon met him with the practiced economy of a killer grown old in the trade, and Jon, terrified and furious, drove his own steel home when the man's guard broke. Together, they left the cat's paw dead upon the floor, blood spreading black across the rushes, and the boy stood shaking, staring at his crimsoned hands. Daemon did not comfort him. He crouched beside the corpse and turned the fine dagger in the lamplight, and then he looked up at Jon with eyes that held no softness, only a terrible clarity. He told the boy that this was the last lesson before the sea, and the most important of all the things he had tried to teach him. The Starks, he said, were already at war, whether they wished to name it so or not, for someone with gold enough to buy Valyrian steel and reach enough to strike inside Winterfell had marked them for death, and no amount of northern honor would change that plain and bloody fact. Men who refused to see the war they were in did not thereby escape it. They only died first, and died unready. Jon looked from the dead man to the old prince, and something in his face hardened into a new and older thing, and Daemon knew, watching him, that the boy had finally begun to understand. The ship that carried them from the eastern shore was a lean trading galley out of Pentos, its hull painted the deep red of old wine, and Jon Snow stood at its rail for the better part of that first day, watching the land of his birth diminish into a gray smudge upon the horizon. He had never before seen the world curve away to nothing, had never felt the deck lift and fall beneath him like the breathing of some vast and patient beast. And though the salt wind stung his eyes, he did not look away until the last hint of Westeros had dissolved into the mist. Daemon watched him from the shade of the mainmast, saying nothing, understanding that a man must be permitted to grieve the leaving of a place, even when the leaving is necessary, even when the place itself would have seen him buried. Braavos rose out of the sea like a thing dreamed rather than built, its 100 small islands stitched together with bridges and canals, the great bronze titan straddling the mouth of its lagoon with the morning sun behind its shoulders. Jon had heard the city named in stories, but no story had prepared him for the smell of it, the tar and brine and spice, the clamor of a dozen tongues braided together in the fish markets, the way the water lapped at the very doorsteps of the tall, dark houses. Daemon moved through these crowded streets as though he had never left them, and in truth, some part of him never had, for the years of his long exile had worn grooves into this city that even decades could not smooth away. The men Daemon sought out in the days that followed were not the sort a northern boy would have imagined keeping company with a prince. There were bankers of the Iron Bank who spoke in soft, measured voices and forgot nothing, sellsword captains scarred and easy in their laughter, a woman who kept a house of many doors and knew the secret business of half the merchant princes in the city. To each of them, Daemon presented the boy as an apprentice, a nephew, a promising blade in need of polish, and each of them took Jon in hand and taught him what they knew. He learned the Braavosi tongue until he could dream in it, learned the weight and worth of a dozen coinages, and the tricks by which honest metal was made dishonest, learned that a contract signed in ink might bind a man more surely than any vow sworn before a heart tree. He learned, most of all, to watch, to measure the room before he entered it, to hear the thing left unsaid beneath the thing spoken aloud. Slowly, without his marking the day it happened, the sheltered boy of Winterfell fell away from him, His shoulders broadened with the labor of the training yards and the long climbs across the city's bridges. His face grew leaner and harder about the eyes, and there settled over him a stillness that made older men take him more seriously than his years deserved. He was becoming something new, something that was neither wholly the bastard of Winterfell, nor yet whatever Daemon intended him to be. And the old prince watched this becoming with a satisfaction he took care to hide. Then the news came, as news always came to Braavos, carried on the tongues of sailors and the pages of ledgers before it reached the ears of kings. Lord Eddard Stark had been taken. The hand of the king, the man who had raised Jon and given him his name, sat now in the black cells beneath the Red Keep, accused of treason, and the great houses of the realm were sliding one by one toward open war. Jon read the letter that a factor of the Iron Bank set before him, and read it again, and the color went out of his face as though a wound had been opened in him. He wanted to go at once. He said as much to Daemon that same night, standing in the narrow room they shared above a canal, his voice raw with the wanting of it, and Daemon let him speak until the words ran out. Then he answered in the quiet tone he used only when he meant a thing to be remembered. "A boy with a sword," he said, "changes nothing. He rides south. He is recognized. He is killed. And the world is precisely as it was, save that a promising blade lies rotting in a ditch. An army changes everything, and a man who commands a claim that no army in the world can ignore changes everything twice over." Jon did not understand the second half of what he had heard, and he said so. Daemon crossed to the window and looked out over the black water and the lanterns swimming upon it, and for a long moment he seemed to weigh something too heavy to lift. When he turned back, he spoke the truth he had carried across the sea and never yet set down. Jon was no bastard, he said. His mother had not been some tavern girl, but a lady of great house, and his father had been Rhaegar Targaryen, dead prince and dragon's heir, and the blood that ran in the boy's veins was the blood of old Valyria and of dragons. Jon laughed, and then he did not, for there was no laughter in the old man's face. He said it could not be true, that Ned Stark would never have lied to him, that it was madness. And Daemon told him then of a girl across the wider sea, a girl named Daenerys, who had walked into fire and walked out again, with living dragons at her breast. And Jon stood very still in the lamplight, his whole world tilting slowly and terribly beneath him. The word came upon the salt wind, as such words always seem to come, carried by ships that had left King's Landing before the crows could outrace them. It came in fragments first, whispered in the taverns along the harbor, half-believed rumor passed between men who had no reason to lie and no way to know the truth of it. Then it came in certainty, spoken by a Braavosi merchant who had seen it with his own eyes, standing in the press of the crowd upon the steps of the Sept of Baelor, and the certainty of it fell upon the small rented room like a stone through ice. Ned Stark was dead, the man who had raised Jon, who had given him a name and a place and a father's stern love, had knelt upon the marble steps in the burning southern light, and had his head struck from his shoulders at the word of a boy king. Jon heard it and did not move at first, and then something within him broke that could not be unbroken, and he wept without shame or restraint. The great heaving grief of a boy who had lost the only anchor his life had ever known. And when the weeping burned itself down to embers, there rose in its place a fury so pure and so cold that Daemon, watching from the shadowed corner of the room, felt something turn in his own old heart. Jon spoke of sailing home. He spoke of finding Joffrey and putting a sword through his gilded throat, of burning the Red Keep to its foundations, of vengeance so complete that the very stones of the city would remember it. His hands shook as he spoke, and his eyes were bright and terrible, and Daemon let him speak until the words had spent themselves against the walls. For Daemon, too, was shaken in a way he had not expected to be. He had known Ned Stark only through report and reputation, a grim northern lord with a face carved from the same cold stone as his ancestral seat. And yet Daemon had come, across the long years of scheming, to hold a grudging respect for the man's stubborn honor, a thing so rare in the world that its loss felt like the dimming of some small and honest light. But respect did not blind him, and grief did not soften his purpose. When at last Jon fell silent, Daemon crossed to him and took him by the shoulders, and he spoke not to the boy's rage but through it, into the deeper thing beneath. "A blade thrown in fury shatters," he said, "but a blade tempered slowly in cold water holds an edge that outlives its maker. To sail home now was to die home now. A single sword against a kingdom, a boy's noble corpse washed up on some southern shore for the gulls to pick clean. That was not vengeance. That was surrender dressed in the borrowed clothes of courage." And Jon, trembling, listening, felt the fire within him begin to change its nature, to cool and harden into something that would keep. In the days that followed, the world itself seemed to fracture along with Jon's grief. Word came that the North had risen, that Robb Stark had ridden south with the strength of the mountains and the rivers behind him, and that his bannermen had lifted their swords and named him king in the North, the first such king in 300 years. Daemon spread a stained map upon the table one evening and traced the fractures with a long finger, showing Jon the shape of the ruin that was coming. There was Joffrey upon the Iron Throne, and Stannis brooding upon his rock, and Renly gathering the flowers of the Reach beneath his gaudy banners, and Balon Greyjoy stirring in his Iron Islands, and now Robb in the frozen North. 5 kings, Daemon said, and each of them certain that the gods themselves had chosen him, and each of them wrong. This was the chaos into which a forgotten dragon might rise, he told Jon, his voice low and steady as the tide against the harbor stones. When the great houses tore one another to pieces, when the fields lay salted and the lords lay dead, then a claimant of the true blood, patient and unspent, might gather the pieces that remained, but only for one who understood that the war would be won not in its first glorious year, but in its last exhausted one, only for one who could bear to wait while lesser men burned themselves to ash, chasing their crowns. And it was then, on a night when the lanterns of Braavos swam in the black water beyond the window, that Jon made the first truly independent choice of his life. He would not sit idle, he said, taking coin as a common sellsword while his brother bled and the realm burned. If the blood in his veins was true, if there was another Targaryen across the wider sea with living dragons at her breast, then they would go to her. They would find this Daenerys, and they would stand together, the last of the dragon's line, and no army of 100 quarreling kings could stand against fire made flesh. He said it with the fierce conviction of a boy who believed the thought his own, born whole from his own grief and cunning. Daemon inclined his head slowly, and in the shadow of the lamplight he allowed himself the smallest and most private of smiles. For he had turned the boy's mind toward this shore across many patient weeks, laying each stone of the path so gently that Jon had never once seen the hand that laid it. The plan was born now, and it lived in Jon as his own, which was the only way such a plan could ever truly live. The road east began at the edge of the world, where the great fabled city of Qarth stood behind its triple walls like a jewel set into the dust, and where the merchant princes in their painted silks watched 2 strangers pass through the gates with the wary indifference of men who had seen every kind of fortune come and go. They traveled light and quiet, an old warrior with silvered hair and hard violet eyes, and a lean young man whose gray gaze missed nothing. And though they carried little of value, they carried themselves in a way that made lesser men step aside. Beyond Karth, the land opened into the vast grasslands the Dothraki called their sea, an ocean of tall waving stalks that ran gold and green to every horizon. And here, the danger changed its shape from the polished cruelty of cities to something older and simpler, the danger of open spaces where a man might die and never be found. They were not always alone in that emptiness. Twice, bands of masterless riders came upon them, thinking two travelers easy prey, and twice, Jon learned what it truly was to fight for his life rather than for the marks a master gave in a training yard. The first ambush left his hands shaking long into the night, though he had done what needed doing with a coldness that surprised him. Daemon watched him afterward, watched the way the boy sat apart and stared at nothing, and he said only that the shaking meant he was still a man, and that a man who did not shake at all had lost something worth grieving. It was the gentlest thing he had ever said to him, and Jon remembered it. At a caravan way station of mud brick and torn awnings, they found men willing to sell their swords, and here Jon discovered a gift he had not known he possessed. Daemon's name and reputation drew the sellswords like moths, for even so far from Westeros, the old stories of the rogue prince had drifted eastward on the tongues of travelers. But it was Jon who held them once they had gathered. He did not bluster or promise mountains of gold he could not give. He looked each man in the eye, learned his name, spoke to him as though his life mattered, and asked what he wanted and what he feared. And the men found themselves following this quiet northern youth almost before they understood why. There was in him the fairness of the father who had raised him, Eddard Stark's stubborn refusal to treat any man as beneath his notice, and there was, too, the harder edge that Daemon had honed, the willingness to do the necessary thing without flinching. The two together made something rare, and the small band that formed around them was loyal in a way that gold alone could never purchase. It was on a cold night beneath a sky spilling with stars that Daemon told him the truth of himself at last, the whole of it, and not the pieces he had doled out before. He spoke of wives he had loved and lost, of Rhea whom he had never mourned, and Laena whom he had, of the daughters born of that love. He spoke of his sons, and here his voice, which had never once wavered in battle, grew thin and uncertain. He told of the great war his family had waged upon itself, the dance that had turned dragon against dragon until the sky itself had burned, and the beasts that had made his house, the terror of the world, lay dead in the mud, one by one, until almost none remained. He had helped to break the dragons, he confessed, he and his kin, through pride and grief and vengeance, and he had lived long past the point where living gave him any joy. And then, in a voice near to breaking, he told Jon why he had truly taken him, that in the wreckage of everything he had loved and lost, he had wished, foolishly and desperately, to shape one last thing of worth, to father something great before the end, even if the blood between them was not his own. Jon said nothing for a long while, and then he reached out and gripped the old man's shoulder, and in that touch, a bond was forged that neither of them could have named, complicated and true, the closest thing to a son and father that either would ever again know. Word reached them at a river crossing, where traders bartered in a dozen tongues. Word carried on rumor and repeated until it hardened into something like fact, that a silver-haired queen with 3 living dragons had gathered ships and turned them toward the ruined cities of Slaver's Bay. Daenerys Targaryen was no longer a whisper and a hope, but a fixed point upon the map, moving, purposeful, drawing the eyes of the world toward the coast of that broken land. It would be many months yet before their paths crossed, for by the time they reached her, she had already taken city after city and sat at last enthroned in conquered Meereen. Toward the coast of that broken land, Jon and Daemon turned their small company north and west without a night's delay, driving hard to cut across the path she would take before the sea swallowed her from their reach. And in the long hours of that pursuit, Jon rehearsed over and over the thing that troubled him more than any ambush or any blade, for he understood the impossible weight of what he meant to claim. He would ride to a queen who commanded fire made flesh and tell her that he, a bastard raised in the cold and the snow, was her own blood, kin to her lost brothers, a Targaryen in truth. He had no scroll, no seal, no witness living who could swear to it, only the certainty Daemon had planted in him and the conviction burning in his own chest. And he knew, riding through the darkness toward her, that conviction alone had never yet convinced a soul. The great pyramid of Meereen rose from the dust of that conquered city like a mountain shaped by human hands, its terraces climbing toward a summit where a black banner bearing a red three-headed dragon hung motionless in the heavy air. Jon and Daemon came to it not as conquerors nor as beggars, but as something the guards at the gate could not name. Two riders, travel-worn and quiet, one old and gray-eyed and terribly still, the other young with the northern winter written in the set of his shoulders. They were relieved of their weapons, questioned, watched, and passed at last up through the long ascending halls where the walls still bore the marks of the slavers who had ruled there, until they stood before the great throne room and the woman who now sat within it. Daenerys Targaryen received them from a high seat of dark stone, and around her gathered the men and women who had crossed the world at her side, hard-faced and suspicious, their hands never far from the hilts they wore. She was younger than Jon had imagined, and far more composed, a silver-haired figure, holding perfect stillness, while her eyes moved across the two strangers, with a scrutiny that gave nothing away. When Daemon's name was spoken aloud into that chamber, a murmur ran through the assembled court like wind through dry grass, for there were those among them who knew the old songs, who understood that a living man of the dance standing upon the floor before them was a thing that could not be, a ghost dragged out of the bloodiest chapter of their house's history. Her advisors pressed close and spoke low and urgent warnings into her ear, telling her that these two might be creatures sent by her enemies, assassins wearing borrowed legends, or rival claimants come to poison her cause from within, and that a wise queen would put them to the sword before they could speak another word. Daenerys listened to all of it without moving, and when the council had run its course, she lifted one hand for silence and turned her gaze upon the older of the two men and bid him say what he had come so far to say. Then Daemon did a thing that not one soul in that room, nor perhaps in all the world, would have believed him capable of doing, for he lowered himself slowly to one knee upon the cold stone, this man who had bent to no one across the long, strange decades of his unnatural life. There was no mockery in it and no theater, only a heavy, deliberate weight, the surrender of a pride so old it had calcified into the shape of a man. He named himself plainly, and he named the boy beside him, and he told her that this was the son of Rhaegar, born of the union with Lyanna Stark, hidden away in the frozen north, and raised without knowledge of his blood until the truth had found him at last. He offered her their loyalty, the swords and the counsel of the two men who had crossed the width of the world to kneel before her. And he spoke of a Targaryen restoration made whole, of the last scattered embers of the dragon's line, gathered at last into a single fire. Jon felt the eyes of the court fasten upon him like hooks, and he understood that Daemon had just presented him as a claim, a piece upon a board, and something in him rebelled against it. When Daenerys turned to him and asked what he sought, he did not reach for the grand and hollow phrases that a suppliant might have chosen, but told her simply that he had not come across the world to take a throne from her hands, that he sought only the truth of his own blood and justice for the father he had never known, and that whatever she chose to believe of him, he would not stand as her rival. There was a directness in his voice that unsettled the room more than any flattery could have done. For flattery they knew how to distrust, while this plain northern honesty they had no ready answer for. Daenerys weighed them both in a long silence, and then she called upon the only witness she trusted, and the great doors at the far end of the hall were opened. Rhaegal came in low and wary, a green shape of scale and smoke that filled the chamber, and though the court was cleared of all but the queen's closest before the beast approached, so that no rumor of the bonding might spread, the handful who witnessed it would carry the memory like a hidden coal. It passed the queen without pause and came to Jon, and where every other man would have flinched or fled, Jon held his ground, and the great beast lowered its head until the heat of its breath washed over him, and its nostrils drank the scent of him, and it made a low sound deep in its throat that was not a threat, but a recognition. The whole room understood in that instant that here was proof no scroll could equal, the blood of the dragon calling to its own. A naive claimant would have seized upon that moment, would have raised his arms and proclaimed himself vindicated before the trembling court, and in doing so would have hardened every fear that Daenerys held. But Jon had been taught by a colder teacher, and he read the terror in the faces around him, the way the queen's own composure had cracked into something guarded and afraid, and so he stepped back from the dragon and spoke quietly that beasts were drawn to many things, that this proved nothing a wary heart need fear, and that he remained her servant and not her equal. He gave away the very thing another man would have grasped, and in that calculated surrender, he saw the first true softening in the eyes of the queen. The days that followed drew Jon and Daemon deeper into the machinery of the queen's rule, into the pyramid of Meereen, where the air hung thick with incense and old blood, where painted columns rose toward ceilings lost in shadow, and where the great and the desperate gathered each morning to lay their grievances at the foot of a woman who had never wanted a throne so much as she had wanted to deserve one. It was in that hall of echoing marble that the true nature of the alliance revealed itself. For Daemon Targaryen had lived and died, and lived again, in the ruthless calculus of Westerosi power, and he found the queen's court a nest of well-meaning fools who mistook restraint for wisdom. The dwarf of Casterly Rock had made himself indispensable in these chambers, and it was between him and Daemon that the first fractures appeared. Tyrion spoke of coin and consequence, of the fragile web of trade that fed the freed cities, of how a queen who ruled by terror would find her subjects fleeing the moment her dragons flew elsewhere. Daemon listened with the patience of a man who had heard every argument for mercy ever devised and buried the men who made them. When he answered, his voice was soft, almost gentle, and all the more chilling for it. He said that the masters of Slaver's Bay understood only one language, that every day the queen spent negotiating was a day her enemies used to sharpen their knives, and that a single act of decisive violence, delivered without hesitation, purchased more peace than 1,000 counsels. He did not raise his voice, He never needed to. Jon stood at the edge of these disputes, torn between two fathers he had never been permitted to fully claim. Ned Stark had raised him to believe that a lord who passed the sentence should swing the sword, that mercy was not weakness, but the discipline of a strong hand, that a ruler who governed through fear ruled only until the fear broke. He argued for the slower path, for courts and granaries, and the patient labor of building something that would outlast the one who built it. And Daenerys found in his words a reflection of the queen she wished to be. Yet Jon had also learned at Daemon's side the arithmetic of survival, and he understood, uneasily, that his uncle was not always wrong, and that mercy offered to a man who would gladly cut your throat was not virtue, but suicide dressed in fine words. The bond between Jon and the queen grew in these long days, in the quiet hours after the court had emptied, when the two of them would stand upon the high terrace and watch the sun sink red over the Slaver's Bay, speaking of the north he had left and the home she had never known. There was something true in it, a recognition between two exiles who had been shaped by loss into something harder than they wished to be. But Daemon watched the growing closeness with the eye of a gardener assessing a graft, and one evening, he took Jon aside into the cool shadow of a colonnade and spoke plainly of what such a union might mean. A dragon who married a rival, he said, did not weaken his own claim, but doubled it, binding two rivers of fire into a single flood that no lord in Westeros could stand against. He counseled his nephew to let the affection grow, but never to forget that affection was itself a kind of weapon, and Jon felt something cold settle in his stomach, even as he understood the wisdom of it. He did not want to think of Daenerys as a piece upon a board. He knew that he was learning to, all the same. Then the crisis came, as Daemon had always warned it would, rising out of the shadowed alleys of the city like smoke before a fire. The Sons of the Harmony, that masked brotherhood of embittered masters, made common cause with the slaver factions of Yunkai and Astapor, and in a single coordinated stroke, they struck at the queen's authority in the streets and the walls alike, murdering her freedmen in the dark and gathering armed sellswords beyond the gates. The court dissolved into panic, into competing councils that could agree on nothing, and it was in that chaos that Daenerys turned, almost without deciding to, toward the quiet gray-eyed man who had been schooled in war by the deadliest blade the dynasty had ever produced. Jon took command as though he had been born to it. He remembered every lesson Daemon had ground into him upon the training yards, the way a smaller force could shatter a larger one through timing and terrain, and the courage to strike where the enemy believed themselves safe. He drew the sellswords into the narrow streets where their numbers meant nothing. He loosed the unsullied in disciplined wedges against their flanks, and he held the great gate through a long and bloody night by refusing to yield a single step. When dawn broke over Meereen, the Sons of the Harmony were broken with it, their leaders dead or fled, their conspiracy scattered like ash upon the harbor wind, and the city that had trembled now looked upon Jon Snow with something close to awe. Daenerys thanked him before the assembled court, and her gratitude was warm and genuine, and edged with the faintest shadow of unease. For in the corners of that great hall, among the whispering courtiers and the freedmen who had watched him fight, a new murmur had begun to move, low and dangerous and impossible to unhear, that the queen had brought a warrior into her house who fought like a king, and that perhaps the sun now outshone the very son he served. The whisper did not stay a whisper for long, for such things never do in a court where too many hearts hunger and too many tongues have grown accustomed to the trade of secrets. Within a fortnight, the murmur had swelled into something with a shape and a name. and the shape it took was the memory of a man long dead, and the name was Rhaegar. It began, as such rumors so often do, with those who had loved the elder brother more than they had ever thought to love the sister, old men whose loyalties had frozen in the winter of their exile, and who had never quite thawed toward the girl queen with her dragons and her freed slaves. They looked upon Jon and saw the shadow of a prince they had followed into the disaster at the Trident, and they whispered that here was his blood made flesh, his true-born son, and that a son stood above a sister in every law men had ever written of the Iron Throne. Daemon heard it before Jon did, as he heard most things, moving through the lower halls and the wine sinks and the barracks with the easy grace of a man who had spent his youth learning precisely how poison entered a house. He came to Jon in the gray hour before dawn, when the boy sat cleaning the blade he had carried through the long night of the uprising, and he did not soften what he had to say, for softening it would have wasted time they did not have. "They are saying you should be king," Daemon told him, standing in the narrow window's light with his arms folded and his face unreadable. "Not that you might be, not that you could be, that you should be. And once men begin to say a thing like that aloud, nephew, there is no unspeaking it. It hangs in the air like smoke, and it settles into cloth and stone, and it does not leave until either the man it names is dead, or the throne it points toward is his." Jon set the whetstone down slowly, and the cold of the chamber seemed to deepen around him. "I have never wanted it," he said. "I swore no oath to any throne. I came here to serve her, not to supplant her." "I know that," Daemon answered, and something almost gentle moved behind his eyes. "I have watched you long enough to know it in my bones. But wanting has never been the danger, boy. The danger is the wanting of others, poured into you like wine into a cup that never asked to be filled. You have become a vessel for ambition you did not choose, and a vessel does not get to decide what it holds." The counsel that followed was hard and clear, and it was the counsel of a man who had lived through the ruin that came when two dragons could not share a single sky. "Jon must go before the court," Daemon said, "before the queen and all her retinue and all the whispering exiles, and he must renounce any claim to the Iron Throne with his own mouth and his own will, plainly and without reservation, and he must pledge himself to Daenerys not as a rival, but as her shield and her sword." It would not silence the whispers, for nothing silenced whispers entirely, but it would buy time, and time was the only currency that mattered when the alternative was fire. Jon agreed, for it cost him nothing he valued to surrender a crown he had never desired, and there was relief in the surrender, a lightness, like the setting down of a burden he had not known he carried. He knelt before Daenerys in the Great Pyramid, upon the cold marble that still bore the faint stains of the recent fighting, and he spoke his renunciation in a voice that did not waver, and the queen received it with grace and with a warmth that seemed, in that moment, wholly true. Yet even as he rose, Jon saw what Daemon had warned him he would see, for in the faces of the old loyalists gathered along the walls, there was not disappointment, but a strange and terrible tenderness, the look of men who cherished a thing all the more for its humility, who saw in a prince who would not reach for power the very proof that power belonged to him alone. He understood then, with a slow and sickening clarity, that he could not renounce his way out of it. The more he refused the crown, the more they loved him for the refusing, and the more they gathered, and the murmur that had begun in corners now moved openly through the streets of Meereen, until it reached the ears of those who counseled the queen that a threat unremoved was a threat that grew. There were voices in Daenerys's council who spoke the old and simple remedy, the one that dynasties had always reached for when a rival's blood grew inconvenient, and they spoke it quietly and reasonably, as men speak of pruning a tree. But the queen would not hear it. She had lost too much to spend more of her own blood, and she had seen the boy fight for her city, and something in her recoiled from the thought of becoming the very kinslayer her house was cursed to breed. Instead, she summoned Jon before her once more, and she named him her sworn sword and the commander of all her armies, binding him to her side with honor and with duty, drawing the rival so close that no faction could raise him against her without raising him against himself. It satisfied no one wholly, and Daemon, watching from the shadow of a pillar, felt a cold certainty settle over him that he had planted, with his own careful hands, the seed of a second dance. The word came from the east in fragments, as terrible news so often does, carried by a courier whose horse had been ridden nearly to death and whose voice cracked when he spoke. Daemon had built his network patiently over years, threads of coin and obligation stretching from the free cities into the ports of Westeros and inland to the taverns where servants drank and gossiped. And it was through one such thread that a whisper had reached him of something rotten fermenting between the houses of Frey and Bolton. He had acted upon it at once, dispatching a warning to sail west, sealed and swift. But the sea was wide, and the winds were cruel, and the message that might have saved a king arrived at a castle already washed in blood. The Red Wedding had come and gone. Robb Stark was dead. Catelyn Stark was dead. The northern host that had ridden south in righteousness had been butchered at a feast beneath a roof that should have promised sanctuary, and the guest right that had bound men since the age of heroes had been broken as casually as a man snaps a chicken bone. Jon received the news alone, in the chamber that had become his in the Great Pyramid of Meereen, where the light fell in long amber bars across the stone floor, and the air smelled faintly of dust and salt. He did not weep at first. He sat very still, his hands open upon his knees, and he let the words settle into him one by one, and it was only when the full shape of it had assembled itself in his mind that he understood the particular cruelty of the thing. He had spent years learning patience. Daemon had taught him to wait, to gather strength before spending it, to refuse the reckless charge in favor of the long and quiet game. And he had believed in that teaching, had shaped himself around it, and now his brother lay dead in the north, while he had lingered in the east, learning to be strong. Had he sailed the moment he heard the first rumor of war? Had he abandoned patience and thrown himself westward with fire at his back? Perhaps he would have reached Robb in time. The thought coiled through him like a slow poison, and he understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the tragedy was not a thing that had happened to him from outside. It was a consequence. It had grown from the very path he had chosen to walk. Daemon found him hours later, when the light had gone violet and the torches had not yet been lit. He did not offer comfort, for he was not a man who knew how, and he understood that comfort was not what the boy needed. Instead, he stood in the doorway with his arms folded and watched his student sit in the gathering dark, and after a long while, he said only that grief was a blade like any other, and that a man could either let it turn in his own gut or he could set it in another's. Jon did not answer for a time. When he rose, something in his face had changed, hardened, set itself into a shape that would not easily soften again. The softness of the grieving boy had folded itself inward, and around it had grown the resolve of a man who had decided precisely where his sorrow would be spent. He went before Daenerys the next morning, and he did not kneel, though he might have. He stood before her throne, with the gray light of dawn falling through the high windows, and he spoke to her, not as a sworn sword to his queen, but as one wounded soul to another, reminding her of the family that fire and treachery had taken from her, and setting his own loss beside it, like a matching wound. The Lannisters who had beheaded his father, he told her, the Freys who had murdered his brother beneath a broken oath, the Boltons who now flayed the North and sat in the halls of his childhood, all of them had grown fat upon the murder of houses that had done them no wrong. Meereen was a fine city, he said, and its liberation was a worthy thing, but it was not her city, and it never would be. Westeros was her birthright, stolen from her in her cradle, and it was the only throne worth the crossing. She listened, and he saw the old fire wake behind her eyes, the ambition that had never truly slept, but had only been waiting for a voice to name it aloud. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, and then she was silent a long while, and then she told him that the sons of the Harmony would rise again the moment her dragons flew elsewhere, that Meereen was a chain around her ankle, disguised as a crown, and that he had only named aloud the thing she had feared to admit, that she had been ruling a city to avoid the harder truth that her war was across the sea, and that they would sail west together and give the murderers of both their houses the answer of dragonfire. But long before any sail was set, Daemon's threads were already working in the north. He sent word along the quiet channels he had spent years spinning, into the hearths of northern houses that seethed beneath the Bolton yoke, and the message he seeded was simple and dangerous and full of hope. Ned Stark's fostered son lived. He had crossed the narrow sea and returned a warrior, and he rode among dragons, and he would come. In the mountain halls and the frozen holdfasts where men had thought all their lords dead and their cause extinguished, the whisper began to pass from mouth to mouth, like an ember carried on the wind, and in the darkness of the occupied north, something that had been thought long dead began, very quietly, to stir. The gathering of the host at Meereen was a thing that men would speak of for generations, though few of them would ever agree on precisely how it began, or how it swelled so quickly into something the free cities had never witnessed. The Unsullied stood in their disciplined ranks upon the docks, spears rising in perfect columns beneath the eastern sun, silent as the stones they seemed carved from, while beyond them, the Dothraki filled the plains with their restless thousands, their horses stamping and snorting in the dry heat, their riders eyeing the vast waters they had been taught since birth to fear. Sellsword companies had drifted in from every corner of the disputed lands, drawn by rumor and coin, and the whisper that a queen with 3 dragons meant to reshape the world, and among them moved the freed men of Slaver's Bay, who had chosen to follow the woman who had unshackled them into a war on the far side of the sea. Above it all, the dragons wheeled and cried, their shadows sweeping across the assembling fleet, and where their wings passed the men below fell quiet and lifted their faces, for it was one thing to hear of dragons, and quite another to feel the wind of them stir the hair upon your scalp. Drogon rode the current's highest of the 3, black and terrible, while his brothers turned in wide, slow circles above the harbor, and Daenerys stood upon the walls watching them with a stillness that Jon had come to recognize as the shape her resolve took when it had finished forming. The council that met to decide the shape of the war was held in a chamber of pale marble where the sea breeze moved the hanging silks, and it was there that the leadership of the host divided against itself. Daemon spoke first, and spoke plainly, arguing that the whole purpose of dragons was terror, that a swift and merciless stroke against King's Landing would shatter the Lannister regime before it could gather its strength, that the war might be ended in a single afternoon of fire, if only they had the stomach to strike at the heart. Several of the sellsword captains murmured their agreement, for a short war was a profitable war, and the notion of burning the seat of their enemies held a grim simplicity that appealed to men who lived by the sword. Jon let them speak until the speaking was done, and then he rose, and the weight of the years of training that Daemon himself had poured into him showed in the calm with which he stood. He said that a queen who came to Westeros trailing ash behind her would rule over ash, that the small faces of the realm would not love a liberator who had melted the Red Keep with its servants and children still inside, and that a throne, won by fear alone, was a throne that must be defended by fear forever. He said that the North still bled beneath the Boltons, that its people remembered the Starks and hated the men who had murdered them, and that a queen who freed the North first would win not merely a battlefield but a people, a loyal power base rooted in gratitude rather than dread. Daenerys listened with her hands folded and her violet eyes moving between the two men she trusted above all others. And when Jon had finished, she was quiet for a time, and then she said that she had spent her whole life wanting the Iron Throne and had never once stopped to ask what she wished to sit upon it as. She would not begin her reign as her father had ended his. The fleet would sail, she declared, but it would sail north first, and it would come not as a fire, but as a deliverance. And Daemon inclined his head to his kinsman with something that might have been pride buried beneath his customary irony. So the great fleet put out from Meereen far sooner and far stronger than any watcher in Westeros could have dreamed, and the swiftness of it was itself a weapon, for the Lannister regime had reckoned on years of squabbling among the eastern powers, and instead found the sea filling with sails, while their spies still argued over whether the Targaryen girl even meant to come at all. The crossing was long, and the dragons ranged ahead of the ships like heralds, and when the vanguard made landfall upon the northern coast, the men who splashed ashore into the gray surf found a land locked in cold and grievance, waiting for a spark. Jon led that vanguard himself, and it was he who rode inland beneath the banner of the direwolf that had not flown openly in that country for years. In hall after hall, the northern lords came out to meet the stranger who claimed the old cause, and it was in the mountain seat of a house long loyal to the Starks that he first drew back his hood and let them look upon his face, and an old knight who had known Ned Stark in his youth went white as the snow beyond the door and sank to his knees, for the resemblance was a ghost made flesh. The word ran outward faster than any horse could carry it, and men who had hidden their grief for years wept openly and reached for swords they had buried in the thatch. Far to the south, the Boltons heard the news brought by a breathless rider, and the flayed man and his Frey allies began at once to draw their strength inward toward the ancient walls of Winterfell, mustering to hold the stolen seat against the boy they had believed was dust, while beyond the ramparts, the north itself was rising. They gathered him upon the wide white plains south of Winterfell in the last gray days before winter closed the roads entirely, the loyal houses coming down from their hills and their forests with what men they could raise. And Jon marshaled them not as the boy who had once been sent to the wall, but as a captain schooled in a harder country, moving among their fires by night to learn their tempers, and setting them in the disposition Daemon had taught him upon the marches of the stepstones. He did not scatter his strength in the old northern way of a headlong charge upon the enemy line. He held his best men close, and hidden behind a screen of skirmishers, he chose the ground where the frozen fields fell away into treacherous marsh, so that the heavier Bolton horse would founder, and above it all, wheeling in slow, patient circles against a sky the color of old iron, moved the shadow of the dragon. The battle came at dawn, and it was neither clean nor swift. Roose Bolton fought as he had always fought, coldly and without waste, sending his lines forward in disciplined ranks that broke against the marsh exactly as Jon had foreseen. And where the ice gave way, beneath the destriers, the loyalist spears fell upon them like wolves upon a stumbling stag. When the enemy center wavered, Jon loosed the men he had kept in reserve, and the dragon came down through the smoke with a sound that turned the bravest knees to water, and the Bolton host, which had held together through slaughter, at last came apart at the seams and fled toward the walls that could no longer save them. The snow was churned to red mud by midday, and the crows gathered thick along the ridgelines, and Roose Bolton was cut down among his banners without ever crying out, dying as pale and silent as he had lived. But it was Ramsay whom Jon sought through the wreckage of that field, hunting him from the broken lines back toward the gates, and he cornered the man at last, in the shadow of the Godswood wall, with the great heart tree looming red and weeping behind them. Ramsay had a knife and a smile even then, and he spoke of the things he would have done, meaning to sink his cruelty into Jon like a hook into a fish. And for one long breath something answered in Jon that was not Ned Stark's blood at all. He felt the pull of it clearly, the whisper that this creature deserved a slow unmaking, that mercy here was a kind of cowardice, and he understood in that moment how easily a man might learn to enjoy the suffering of the wicked and call it justice. Daemon had taught him to be pitiless. Ned had taught him that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword and should feel the weight of it and should never take pleasure in the falling. Jon disarmed him, bound him, and had him brought before the assembled lords. And there, beneath the heart tree, he spoke the words his father had spoken, and struck the head from Ramsay Bolton's shoulders with a single clean stroke, lawfully and without joy. And the North watched a Stark's justice done, and knew the old order had come home. Winterfell opened its gates that evening, and men wept upon the walls, and the direwolf banner rose above the broken tower, where it had not flown in years. In the great hall, amid the smell of wood smoke and the guttering of 1,000 torches, the northern lords rose one after another and hailed him, and the cry went up that here was the king in the north. And this time Jon did not refuse it outright, but named a condition that would bind the North's crown to the queen's peace by his own design rather than mere self-denial, a bargain Daemon had taught him to strike, so that his humility itself became leverage. Blood of the old kings, come again to break the southern yoke. Jon stood in the cold light and let the sound wash over him, and then he raised his hand and told them, in a voice pitched low so that they had to still themselves to hear it, that he would not take the crown. He would not fracture the realm again, he said, would not raise the North against the very queen whose dragons had won this ground. For a kingdom divided against itself in the teeth of winter would be no kingdom at all but a grave. The North would be free, he promised them, free under Daenerys's peace, and there were lords who nodded slowly at the wisdom of it, and lords who folded their arms and looked away, seeing a man give back a crown that was his by love, if not by law, and muttering that such largeness of heart was a thing kings could rarely afford. Later, in the maester's turret with the wind howling at the shuttered window, Daemon came to him carrying a leather folio taken from the fled maester's records, and with it an old woman who had served in the sept at the end of the last war, and between the yellowed page and the trembling voice, the last doubt was burned away, for there, in cramped brown ink, was the truth of a marriage in Dorne and a child born beneath a tower of joy. Daemon closed the folio softly and laid his hand upon Jon's shoulder, and told him that he must carry this like a blade sheathed close, unseen, until the war was fully won, for to speak it now was to set the queen against him and cleave their two hosts in the moment they needed most to be one. And Jon looked down at the record of who he truly was and felt the weight of it settle into him like a stone dropped into deep and freezing water. The winter deepened over the north, and with it came a stillness that felt less like peace than the breath drawn before a shout. The lords who had bent the knee to no southern crown in living memory gathered now in the great hall of Winterfell with their furs and their old grievances, and where once they had whispered of Jon Snow as a thing half feared and half loved, they spoke now openly, their voices carrying up into the smoke-darkened rafters. They had followed him through the long dark, had watched him ride the pale dragon and stand unbroken where other men would have fallen, and they had decided among themselves, in the way that stubborn men decide things, that no queen born across the sea could rule the country that had bled for him. It was Lord Glover who spoke it first, rising with his cup in hand and his beard white with the cold that clung to the stones. And it was the Mormont girl who spoke it loudest, her small voice ringing like struck iron. And by the time the fire had burned to embers, the words had hardened into something that could not be taken back. They would crown Jon king in the north, and more than the north if he would have it, and they would not be moved by the gift of a title or the promise of a seat at a distant table. Word of it reached Daenerys before the frost had melted from the courtyard stones, and she received it standing very still at the narrow window of the Lord's chambers, watching the pale light break across the godswood while her heart went cold within her. She had crossed the whole width of the world to claim a throne that had been stolen from her cradle, had walked through fire and buried the men she loved, and burned the chains from thousands. And she had believed, in the private and unspoken country of her hopes, that she had found in Jon not a rival, but the one person living who might understand the loneliness of what she carried. Now the parchment in her hand told her otherwise, and the old suspicion that Daemon himself had once so carefully tended in the early days rose again in her breast, whispering that love was a poor foundation for a crown, and that every man who smiled at her would one day reach for what was hers. It was Daemon who saw the shape of it before either of them could name it, for he had lived it once already, and he knew the smell of the thing, the way an old soldier knows the coming of rain in the ache of a wound. He had stood at the beginning of the last dance of dragons, had watched two branches of a single family look at one another across a table and see not kin but threat, and he had done more than watch, for he had poured his own fury into that fire and fed it with his pride until half of Westeros lay in ash, and the sons he loved were bones beneath still water. All his long life he had been a maker of ambitions, a whisperer at the ears of the young, a man who took the raw ore of a boy's longing and hammered it into a blade, and he had done that very thing to Jon in the beginning, without shame. Yet the night he had watched Jon spare Ramsay's slow death and swing a clean stroke instead, choosing Ned's justice over Daemon's pitilessness, in the one moment cruelty would have been sweetest. Something in the old man had cracked, for he had seen the boy refuse the very lesson Daemon prized most, and be the better man for it in these last cold seasons, watching the boy grow into a man who did not want the crown so much as he feared what wanting it would cost. And Daemon found in himself a thing he had not carried in years, which was the desire to keep something whole rather than to see how brightly it might burn. So he brought them together in the crypts beneath the castle, where the kings of winter sat in stone, with their iron swords across their knees and their blind eyes turned to the dark. And there, among the dead, he told them the truth of what he had lived. He spoke of Rhaenyra and Aegon, of a claim and a crown, and a table where the peace might have held had any among them chosen to bend. And he spoke of how each side had believed itself so certainly in the right that neither could imagine the other as anything but a monster. He told them of the fields he had burned, and the child taken in payment for a child, of dragons falling from the sky like torn banners, and the slow grinding years in which everything they had fought to keep was ground to nothing, so that at the end, the throne itself sat empty, and the dragons were dead, and the family that had held the world had held nothing at all. His voice, which had commanded armies and cowed kings, broke upon the name of a son, and in that breaking, both Jon and Daenerys saw the old man not as a legend, but as the last survivor of a wound that had never healed. He begged them then, and Daemon Targaryen had never in his life begged for anything, to look at one another and see the last of a dying flame, rather than a hand upon a throat, for they were all that remained, and if they turned on each other now, there would be no third generation to mourn them. Something in the cold and the dark, and the weight of the stone kings above them, broke open in both, and Daenerys reached across the space between them and took Jon's hand in hers, and they spoke, haltingly, and without trust, but with something that might in time become it, of a rule they might share. Yet, even as the words were spoken, Daemon looked at the sheathed truth he alone knew Jon carried, and he wondered how long any peace could hold above a secret that deep. The host that moved south in those final days was a river of steel and horseflesh that stretched beyond the sight of any single rider, and it flowed across the King's Road with a patience that betrayed how certain its leaders had grown of the ending toward which they marched. Banners of black and red flew alongside the gray of the north, and the sigils of a dozen houses that had thrown their fortunes behind the pale-haired queen and the quiet man who rode at her side. And the small folk who watched them pass did so not with the terror that armies usually inspired, but with a wary hope. For word had gone before them that this host did not burn the fields it crossed, nor take the daughters of the villages it passed. Daemon rode near the vanguard with the ease of a man who had made this same march in another life, and though his hair had gone silver and his hands bore the small tremors of his years, his eyes missed nothing of the land ahead, reading the approach to the capital the way a physician reads a fevered brow. King's Landing rose before them at last, its walls the color of old bone, beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain. And within those walls, a woman waited who had already decided that if she could not hold the city, she would leave nothing standing for another to hold. Cersei Lannister had fewer swords than the songs would later claim, for the years had not yet given her the alliances that fortune might have granted in some other telling, and cornered as she was, with a Targaryen host at her gate and no fleet coming to her rescue, she turned to the oldest and darkest inheritance the Red Keep still concealed. Beneath the streets, in the sept and the cellars and the dragon pit and 100 forgotten chambers, lay the wildfire caches the Mad King had ordered, laid in the last madness of his reign, and Cersei's pyromancers crept through the dark, with their pale robes and their careful hands, preparing to make of the city a second and final funeral pyre. It was Daemon who saw it first, and he saw it not through any spy or captured letter, but through memory alone, for he had walked the halls of the Red Keep when Aerys had whispered of green fire and the beauty of burning, and he knew the particular hush that fell over a court that was arranging its own immolation. He noticed the absence of certain guildsmen from the taverns their kind frequented, the carts that moved by night toward the sept rather than away from it, the smell that clung faintly to the air near the river gates, and when a captured gold cloak, questioned gently by the fire and less gently by the cold that followed it, spoke of jars buried beneath the holdfast, Daemon went pale beneath his silver and rode at once to the tent where Jon and Daenerys took counsel. He told them what he knew, and he told them what it meant, that the city they meant to take might be turned to a lake of green flame the moment its fall became certain, and that every man, woman, and child within those walls would perish not by the sword, but by a horror that left nothing to bury. Daenerys sat very still as she listened, and Jon watched her face, for he understood that this was the moment toward which the whole of her life had bent, the moment when fire offered itself as both threat and temptation, when the easy path lay in letting the walls burn and calling it the enemy's doing. "There is another way," Jon said, and his voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had learned patience in the snow and never lost it. He laid before them the plan he had shaped through the long marching days, a plan to send picked men through the tunnels the smugglers used and the sewers the maesters had mapped, to seize the caches before Cersei's pyromancers could light them, to strike at the gates from within while the host pressed from without, and to take the city street by street in a fight contained rather than a slaughter unleashed. It was daring to the edge of madness, and it asked of them the harder victory rather than the easier ruin. And when he finished, he looked at Daenerys and said nothing more, for the choice had to be hers and hers alone. She was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Daemon held his breath as he had not held it in decades, watching the granddaughter of the Mad King stand at the same threshold that had swallowed her father whole. "I will not sit a throne made of ashes," she said at last, and something in the tent seemed to ease, as though a held blade had been lowered. "Take the caches, take the city, but do it your way, Jon, and let it be said that I broke the cycle rather than fed it." So it was done, and the fall of King's Landing was a hard thing but not a monstrous one, a fight of hours in narrow streets where the fighting in the streets was brief but savage, Jon's picked men reaching the wildfire caches with moments to spare and cutting down the pyromancers over their unlit jars, and when the Lannister swords saw their queen's fire denied them and the black and red banners already flying from the inner gate, they laid down their arms rather than die for a cause already lost. Cersei was taken living, dragged from the depths of the holdfast where she had gone to light the pyre herself, and Daenerys climbed at last to the black and twisted seat that generations of her blood had coveted and cursed, and Daemon, watching from the foot of the dais with tears he did not trouble to hide, saw in her unbloodied victory the redemption of every war he had ever lost. The days that followed the taking of the city were quiet in the way that battlefields are quiet after the last cry has faded, and in that quiet, Jon Snow carried a weight that no armor had ever equaled. He had known the truth of himself for a long while, had held it the way a man holds a coal in his fist, feeling it burn, but unwilling to open his hand and let it fall where it might set the world alight. Daemon had told him first, across the narrow sea, and then, when the host had reached Winterfell and Jon had knelt by his brother's chair, Bran had confirmed it with that flat and knowing voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the walls of any room, and then the old records had sealed it beyond doubt, and then the old records had confirmed it, the marriage of Rhaegar and Lyanna sealed in a sept beneath a weirwood tree, a union that made him not the bastard of Winterfell, but the true-born son of the crown prince Rhaegar, the elder claim before Daenerys by every law that men had ever written. He had spent long nights with that knowledge, and in every one of them he had heard the voice of the man who had shaped him. Daemon had told him, years before, when the two of them stood upon a windswept ridge with the wall behind them, like a line drawn between the living and the forgotten, that lies between dragons always ended in fire. He had said it without drama, in the plain manner of a man reporting weather, and Jon had not understood then how deeply that lesson was carved into the old prince's bones, how it was the sum of a life spent watching brothers turn on one another, watching whispers become councils and councils become armies. Now, standing in the shadow of the ruined Red Keep with the smell of cold ash still hanging in the corridors, Jon understood that the coal in his hand would burn either way, and that the only choice left to him was whether he would open his fist honestly or wait for it to be pried open by someone who wished him ill. So he went to her. He found Daenerys in the small council chamber where the windows had been broken and boarded, and the light came thin and gray through the gaps, and he sent away the guards and the handmaids and closed the heavy door with his own hands. And then he told her everything. He told it plainly, without softening and without excuse, the marriage and the birth and the tower in Dorne, where his mother had died, bringing him into a world that would have killed him for his name. He watched her face as he spoke, and he saw it change through a country of expressions, from confusion to disbelief to a slow and terrible understanding that settled at last into something cold and glittering and afraid. "You knew," she said, and her voice was very soft, which was worse than any shout could have been. "You knew, and you fought beside me, and you let me climb to that seat, and you knew the whole time that it was never mine to take." She rose from her chair and crossed to the broken window, and the light fell across her silver hair and turned it the color of old iron. "I gave up my fire for you. I spared this city because you asked it. And now you tell me you are the one thing in all the world that could unmake everything I have bled for." "I am telling you," Jon said, "because I would rather you learn it from my mouth than from an enemy's. Because if I keep this secret, it will not stay a secret. It will only grow teeth, and one day it will bite us both, and there will be no undoing it. Daemon taught me that the only chains a dragon cannot break are the ones it forges willingly." He did not move toward her. He stayed where he stood, his hands open at his sides, and there was in his stillness the whole of the choice he had already made in the long nights behind him. "I do not want the throne. I never wanted it. I renounce it now, before you, and I will renounce it again before the whole court, before every lord who might dream of raising my banner. It is yours. It was always yours." For a long moment she said nothing, and the silence in that cold and broken room held the shape of every war that Targaryen blood had ever poured out upon the earth, the dance and the Blackfires, and all the rest of that long red catalogue of brothers and sisters who had chosen the throne over one another. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for her fear to harden into resolve, for the old instinct to whisper that a rival claim was a wound that must be cauterized before it festered. Jon watched the possibility of it move behind her eyes, and he understood that the fate of the realm balanced there on a knife's edge finer than any he had ever walked. It was into that silence that the door opened, for Daemon had not gone far, had waited in the corridor as a man waits outside a birthing room, and now he stepped through and let the door fall shut behind him. He was old now, the black of his hair gone to steel and the lines of his face carved deep by everything he had survived, but he carried still the weight of a legend that no living soul dared dismiss, and when he spoke, both dragons turned to him, as children turn toward a father. "I have watched this exact moment devour our house a dozen times over," he said quietly, "and I did not spend a second life to watch it happen once more. So hear me, both of you, and let me tell you how the peace will hold." What Daemon offered them was not a stratagem born of ambition, but a settlement built to endure, and he laid it out in the low, measured voice of a man who had learned the shape of every mistake by making it. A crown divided against itself, he told them, was no crown at all, and so long as one dragon could be set against another, There would always be some lord in some far hall, dreaming of the day he might play the two of them, like pieces on a board. The remedy was not blood, he said, and here his eyes moved to Daenerys with a gentleness that startled her, for she had braced herself for the counsel of the knife. The remedy was to make their two claims into a single claim, so wholly joined that no living hand could ever prize them apart. And there was one way alone that the Targaryens had ever done such a thing. So it was that in the weeks that followed, beneath the vaulted ceiling of a hall still scorched at its edges from the war that had taken it, Daenerys Targaryen and the man the realm had known as Jon Snow were wed in the old manor of their house, a union that in another life might never have been struck, for a Jon raised only in northern honor could never have swallowed the strangeness of it. But Daemon had spent years teaching him that a crown was a thing to be secured by cold arithmetic and not by the sentiments of the Andals, and so where another Jon would have recoiled, this one saw the sole road that ended without fire, as kin bound to kin, aunt and nephew, dragon and dragon, their two bloodlines folding inward until they became indistinguishable from one another. There were those in the great houses who wrinkled their noses at the strangeness of it, for the customs of the Andals had never made room for such unions, but there were none who could argue against its wisdom, for the marriage did precisely what Daemon had promised it would do. It welded the conquest and the birthright into one seamless thing, and every man who might have schemed to raise Jon against Daenerys, or Daenerys against Jon, found the ground cut from beneath his feet before he could take a single step upon it. The dragons themselves seemed to understand the change, or so it was said afterward by those who watched them in those days, for the great beasts that had once been engines of ruin now took to circling the city in slow, patient arcs, their shadows sweeping across the rooftops, not as threats, but as the wing beats of guardians. Children who would once have fled indoors at the sight of them came instead to the walls to watch, and the fire that had burned so many now warmed a fragile and unfamiliar peace, a peace held together not by fear alone, but by the settled certainty that the throne would not tear itself apart from within. In the north, Jon was confirmed as warden and named Prince of the North beneath the crown, and when he rode at last through the gates of Winterfell, it was not as a bastard returning to a hall that had never quite been his, but as the head of a house restored to its ancient strength. Sansa met him in the yard with the frost still clinging to the stones, and she was no longer the girl who had once dreamed of southern nights, but a woman tempered by every cruelty she had outlived. And when she embraced him, there was in it the weight of everything they had both lost. Arya came to him quieter than he remembered, her hands never far from the blade he himself had given her a lifetime ago, and Bran watched from his chair with eyes that seemed to hold the turning of the world entire, and at Jon's heel padded the great white direwolf ghost, silent as ever, who had followed him from the Wolf's Wood on the day Daemon first came, and had crossed the narrow sea and returned at his side, seeing things that none of them could name. The Starks were whole again, in what ways the living could be made whole, and the North settled beneath Jon's rule with a gratitude that ran deep, for he governed with his father's justice, made supple by everything Daemon had taught him, mercy where mercy could hold, and firmness where it could not, until the small folk spoke his name, the way men speak of a long winter finally broken. The reordering of the great families came without cruelty, but without hesitation, for Daemon had counseled that a settlement which left old wounds open was no settlement at all. Casterly Rock was stripped of the independence it had wielded for centuries, its golden pride humbled into obedience beneath a crown it could no longer buy, and the great vaults that had funded so many wars were made to answer to King's Landing at last. The Freys, who had spilled guest blood beneath their own roof and made a mockery of every law that bound men together, were extinguished root and branch, their crossing given over to hands untainted by the memory of the Red Wedding, so that in time, the very name would fade from the songs. In their place, a new council was seated, drawn not from the proud and the entitled, but from the pragmatic and the surviving, men and women who had learned in the hard years that the realm was a living thing that had to be tended rather than merely ruled. Daenerys offered Daemon a seat among them, the office of hand itself if he would take it, and she made the offer with genuine warmth, for she had come to see in him not the rival she had once feared, but the anchor that had kept her own worst instincts from carrying her away. Daemon considered the crimson banner behind the throne for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, there was in his weathered face something that might almost have been peace. He would take no office, he told her, no title, no seat that could be envied or coveted or used against her by ambitious tongues. He would remain what he had always been to Jon, and now to her both. The private counsel spoken in quiet rooms, the voice at the shoulder that no herald announced and no rival could conspire against. And so the years unfolded, one gentle upon the next, in a manner the older world had never been permitted to know. The peace that Jon and Daenerys held between them did not fracture as so many had predicted it must, for it was not a peace built upon the exhaustion of enemies, but upon the patient labor of two rulers who had each seen where pride and fear could lead, and had chosen instead the slower path of tending what they governed. The North, so long the poorest and hardest of the kingdoms, grew quietly prosperous under a stewardship that neither bled it for southern wars nor abandoned it to its own long winters. Grain filled the storehouses at Winterfell and White Harbor both. Ships came and went from ports that had once stood half empty, and children who had been born into famine and terror grew tall in years that offered them something their parents had scarcely dared to hope for, which was simply the chance to grow old. The realm below the neck healed as well, and it healed in ways that those who had lived through the earlier darkness could not have imagined. There had been no wildfire beneath the streets of King's Landing, waiting to bloom into a green inferno, for that madness had never been permitted to root itself in the halls of power. There had been no war of the Five Kings to hollow the countryside and salt it with the bones of the fallen, no winter marching upon a land already torn to ribbons. The great catastrophe that might have been, the cascade of ruin that had claimed so much in the timeline that no longer existed, had been quietly and permanently averted, and the proof of it was written in the ordinary happiness of ordinary lives, in market days and harvest feasts and the slow rebuilding of what had once seemed beyond saving. Daemon watched it all. He watched from the quiet of Winterfell, where he had chosen at last to settle, an old man, now with hair gone white and hands that had grown slow, though the eyes above the weathered face remained as keen as ever they had been. He watched the family he had saved take root and flourish, and there was in that watching a satisfaction deeper than any conquest had ever given him, for he understood at last that he had done something no dragon or blade had ever accomplished. He had not burned a world, he had grown one. When the end drew near, and Daemon felt it approaching in his bones, the way a man feels the turning of a season, he called Jon to him one final time. They sat together in the chamber that had once been Ned Stark's solar, with a fire crackling low and the northern night pressing soft against the windows. And for a long while, the old man said nothing at all, content merely to look upon the sun he had made. "I came to this place a broken thing," Daemon said finally, and his voice had lost none of its quiet iron even now. "I came seeking shelter and nothing more, a beaten man fleeing a war he had already lost, wanting only a wall to put his back against while he waited to die. "I did not come here looking for you." He paused, and the firelight caught the wetness gathering at the corners of his eyes. "But I found you. I found a boy the world had thrown away, and in the making of you, I finished the thing the dance had torn from me. The dance took everything, Jon. My brother, my sons, my kin, the future I thought I was owed. It left me with ashes, and I carried them for years believing there was nothing else. And then there was you." Jon could not speak. He knelt beside the old man's chair, as he had knelt 1,000 times as a boy, and he took the weathered hand in both of his own. "I have won battles," Daemon went on, softer now. "I have won them in places whose names men still sing, and none of them, not one, ever mattered the way this mattered. Raising you well was the only true victory of my life. Everything else was only fire, and fire consumes even the hand that wields it. But you," he smiled then, "a rare and gentle thing, you I built to last." And Jon wept, openly and without shame, and pressed his forehead to the old man's hand, and thanked him for the shelter, and the harshness, and the patience, and the love that had never once spoken its own name until this moment. And Daemon let him weep, and rested his other hand upon the dark head, as a father rests his hand upon a son. He died a few nights later, quietly, in his sleep, with no wound upon him, and no enemy at the gate, an old dragon gone gentle into the dark at last. He had asked to be buried not among the kings of his line in their cold stone crypts, not entombed with the dynasts and the conquerors whose ambitions had so nearly unmade the world, but here, in the northern earth beside the heart tree, where the roots would take him, and the leaves would whisper above him, through all the seasons to come. And so they laid him there, and Jon planted no monument grander than the ancient weirwood already was, and the last of the dance's restless ghosts was finally, permanently laid to rest. Jon ruled on for many years as the just Prince Daemon had forged him to be, and the cycle of fire and blood that had devoured house after house was broken at last, not by a sword, but by a single act of shelter given long ago, and the world slept easier for it, and grew. We finally reached the end of this alternate timeline, and I'd love to hear what you think. Did you enjoy the direction this story took? Was there a moment that surprised you the most, or a different path you think these characters should have taken? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and many of your ideas inspire future stories. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Every like and comment helps the channel grow and allows me to keep creating new alternate histories of Westeros for you. Thank you for spending your time here, and I'll see you in the next story. Peace out.